give more returns. Get more security and more interest on your fixed deposits from Sri Lanka's largest finance company, LMDtv Finance.
Be part of the solution to make your world a better place. Don't litter. Care for your community by disposing waste properly. Refresh Sri Lanka for a civic-minded society. In association with AICPA and CIMA, CA, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka, and 99X. LMD, the voice of business.
Hello and welcome to LMDtv. Tonight on the forum, we're zooming in on the impact of the economic crisis on the apparel industry in Sri Lanka. And with us, we have the Chief Marketing Officer of MS Intimates, Jehan Jayasuriya. It's very nice to have you on the show, Jehan.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Jehan, to start off our discussion for tonight, what is your take on the state of the Sri Lankan apparel industry, especially against the backdrop of the economic crisis?
Sri Lankan apparel over the last 3 to 4 years, of course, we went through the significant dip, which the entire world went through in 2020, and a very sharp recovery in 2021 as well. Today, we find ourselves in a position where there are multiple headwinds and some tailwinds all sort of blended into what we are seeing. If you look at the numbers that we recorded as an industry in 2022, which was just over 5.5 billion. That's better than what the state of play was pre-pandemic. So on one side, you could look at those numbers and think that things have got to a good place, or the industry has come through the pandemic on a positive footing, and that is largely true. There's some component of that is also there's an element of post-pandemic recovery factored into those numbers. There's an element of Sri Lanka benefiting from some of the geopolitical tensions in the world, especially to do with the US and the sourcing policies associated with the US. Sri Lanka has been a beneficiary of that. So yes, industry in terms of numbers has moved forward. But there's a hint in the last quarter 4 numbers, started to tail off. So we had this really nice rise throughout the first half of the year, even going into quarter 3. But towards quarter 4, we started to see a tailing off. And as we stand today, at the end of February, we're seeing a little bit more of that take place. And you mentioned the economic crisis. I think that has had some part to play in that, in terms of how some of these international brands have viewed Sri Lanka as a sourcing destination. And in some select cases where they felt maybe their exposure was a little too high to Sri Lanka as a location, brands have in some cases rationalized that exposure. So there's an element of that. But I would say the bigger component of that correction is to do with what's taking place in the Western markets. As you know, Sri Lanka exports most of its apparel to the United States, North America in general, and then to the European Union. And those two markets have gone through some stress from a consumer confidence standpoint, consumer spending standpoint, again, driven by inflationary pressures in those markets. And that has had slowdown in spending. Some of the optimism that brands had coming out of the pandemic in terms of the growth numbers that they were forecasting didn't materialize. So there was a high buildup of inventory amongst most of our customer partners. The combination of those two things meant that there was, as typically as is the case in apparel supply chains, a bullwhip effect, where a sharp correction in buys have taken place. So currently what we are experiencing in the last quarter and going into the first quarter of this year, potentially even into the second quarter of this year, is a slowdown in demand. So from a year-on-year perspective, compared to 22, will actually potentially show a degrowth in that sense. Most of it, in my personal reading, is to do with the slowdown in the markets and consumer demand. However, there's perhaps an element of correction that has taken place due to prevailing or stemming from some of the sentiment that came through across our customers, stemming from the economic crisis as well. So it's an interesting, we're at an interesting crossroads for our industry. A number of different factors, like I said, are playing to our favor and some of it against. What this all results in is a scenario where it's a little difficult to forecast what lies ahead in terms of the industry, because there's so many different components influencing it.
Jehan, one might say that despite the challenges, the apparel industry has remained resilient, especially in terms of its contribution to Sri Lanka's export basket. In your view, what really fuels this resilience?
Yes, well, I would say, firstly, Sri Lanka over the last three or four decades, over a period of time, has built a very strong image amongst a certain segment of these Western markets, among certain brands, as a manufacturer or a location where you could source product in a best-in-class, sustainable manufacturing or supply chain environment. I think that's the strength on which we continue to build our industry, and that continues to be a unique selling point for Sri Lanka. We don't play purely on cost. Of course, cost is always going to be an important determinant, but I wouldn't say Sri Lanka is a cost leader, although we are very cost competitive. But really what brings some of these best-in-class brands to our country to source apparel is the strong belief over many years that Sri Lanka is a sustainable location, sustainable from both a social and environmental standpoint. There's world-class talent. So I travel in different parts of the world, different factories. You see more and more Sri Lankan talent that we've actually exported and running the industries in multiple parts of the world. So a lot of that domain knowledge, technical expertise continues to be a differentiator for Sri Lanka. Another important thing which cannot be discounted is Sri Lankan industry has been built on the back of some very, very strong long-standing partnerships. If you look at our biggest brands who source at scale from Sri Lanka have done so for many years and are committed to the island and know the value that we are able to bring. So these are some of the key value propositions that has held the industry in good stead over the years. And makes us resilient. Now, as we move forward, those factors of resilience need to continue evolving, because the very basis on which we have been successful up to now is that we've continued to change and evolve and try to stay ahead of what is really an extension of a very dynamic industry, which is fashion. So fashion continues to evolve and the industry needs to keep pace with that. And accordingly, our industry will need to continue to do the same. So all the factors I mentioned are going to be important. As we move forward, there'll be other factors that that will be important as well that we bring into the mix. Again, some of it we've been on the journey in developing those muscles over the last few years. That's on elevated product innovation, product design, in terms of verticality, in terms of strengthening our supply chains. Enhanced value through business model innovations. So we've spoken about speed models that we operate, which are probably more relevant now than it used to be prior to the pandemic. Just fast, responsive agile business models in which brands look to source their product. Sri Lanka, in many ways, has been a pioneer of those models, and they'll need to continue to evolve. And as you also start to think about the influence of digital technology in our industry, of course, much has been said and written about Industry 4.0 across multiple industries. Its impact on apparel manufacturing has relatively been limited, but again, that's an opportunity for Sri Lanka to invest in and stay at the head of the curve in terms of the digital transformation that we make in our industry. And of course, purely from an engineering standpoint as well, we have a wealth of engineering talent on the island, and purposing them, sort of using them to do advanced engineering, automation to really improve productivity and throughput. So it'll be a combination of multiple other factors on top of what I described earlier, which has brought us up to this point. And I think also very importantly, the mindset to keep changing and evolving before the world asks us to. I think these are things that, in combination of which will continue to make us resilient over the coming months and years.
Jehan, Sri Lanka has a very ambitious objective of meeting an annual apparel industry export goal of $8 billion by 2025. What is needed from the governments and other public entities' point of view to enable industry players to reach this goal?
The government or successive governments have been very supportive of the apparel industry. Of course, apparel contributes in terms of exports, largest contributor to exports in Sri Lanka. In terms of employment, in private sector employment as well, one of the largest contributors as well. Government support has consistently been there for the industry. And I think the private sector, covered by a few of the larger players, and the overall ecosystem, I think is well set in terms of taking this on and moving things forward. But come to, when I say moving things forward in terms of moving towards some of the ambitious goals, as you said, again, there's been ambition laid out to achieve $8 billion by 2025. It's good to work towards ambitious goals always. That's the basis on which most of these private sector organizations have been able to grow into the kind of scale that they have over the years. And I think Sri Lanka's outlook towards the industry should not be any different. What's important, however, is how you build towards that, and what things you might look to do differently to really sort of do a step change in that growth trajectory. What I think will work in Sri Lanka's favor is the fact that I mentioned geopolitical shift in sourcing, especially between the United States and China. I think that perhaps represents one of the largest opportunities for Sri Lanka and other countries, competing countries as well. China continues to, by quite a distance, be the largest apparel exporter in the world, upwards of $150 billion every year. As especially brands from the United States and to some extent in Europe as well look to shift some of that product sourcing away from China, I think Sri Lanka stands well in the crossroads of that, or well in the path of those potential upsides, and stands to benefit. So I think going from the current $5.5 billion mark to $8 billion in that time frame, it is ambitious, but it is not impossible, provided that we build on some of the capabilities that I spoke of, which is mostly in the hands of perhaps the private sector or the players within the industry. The government does have a role to play, as you know, that's an important part. I think under current circumstances, I would say the single biggest role we require is to build confidence in the brand Sri Lanka, not necessarily of the apparel sector, but as a country, as a strong, financially resilient nation, which clearly has taken a beating over the last 12 to 24 months. Both from a financial standpoint as well as from a policy standpoint. I think consistency in policy is perhaps the single most important factor for the industry to thrive and to continue to build on the competencies that I spoke of. it makes it very difficult to do so when as and when things shift, whether that is in terms of, again, as you get into specifics, our path towards sustainable energy, for instance. Again, look, the world has gone through a crisis of energy crisis, and even to date, we see challenges on that front. We just had certain tariff revisions that took place, etc. Again, the whole world has gone through this. It's not just that Sri Lanka has been singled out in terms of some of these headwinds or some of these impacts, but in terms of certain policies to mitigate our reliance on certain sources of energy, I think that's where the opportunity lies. I mentioned earlier, Sri Lanka has been renowned as a sustainable sourcing location. And there's still opportunity for us to incentivize our organizations further, for example, to be a lot more reliant on sustainable sources of energy. And again, that would be one example of how the government could perhaps step in and support the industry to negate some of the headwinds. You wouldn't be able to eliminate them completely. Like I said, these are factors that the entire world is dealing with, but stable, consistent policies with a longer term view to try and be even more resilient in terms of infrastructure, in terms of energy policies and so on, that will help the industry over the long run. I think that's an important piece. The other piece, of course, is in terms of developing talent. I think our government and private university systems have done some good work in that respect. One of the challenges we have, perhaps this might be an indirect impact, is the brain drain or the migration of some of our trained talent. Again, I spoke earlier about seeing export of talent world over, and that's happening at a faster pace today. Again, reverts back to making an environment where Sri Lankan talent who's got to come through our system sees a future and believes in the direction in which country is going. I think so. There might be more supplementary or supportive role that the government sector could play, but the actual value creation within the industry and engaging with customers and converting that to market share, I think the players within the industry are well placed to do so.
We recently saw a 66% hike in electricity tariffs, which is obviously going to have an exponential increase in costs for the apparel industry. What are your suggestions and your recommendations for companies to really overcome this challenge?
Yes, so I touched on it earlier, and maybe they can elaborate on that more. I think as you look at our energy costs, we were we're perhaps not a cost leader, but we were on par or there and thereabouts with some of our leading peer nations in terms of the cost we would have incurred on the industry. And that now with the latest revisions, and I'm sure other countries may also take a view on the energy price on the backdrop of what's happening in terms of especially on fossil fuels. But that increase is definitely going to have an impact on cost competitiveness. Now, the point I was trying to allude to earlier was to say the more incentives that we offer to the industry and those outside the industry to invest in the many different avenues of solar or renewable energy sources, basically, to kick in at scale and help negate some of those impacts. I think that's going to hold the industry in good stead. And I know that some moves have already been made in the recent past, which is very encouraging to see, whether that's certain incentives on financing, elimination of certain tariffs, etc. But there's still perhaps more that we can do in terms of whether it is net metering or other measures to incentivize more and more people to join this movement and just in general make the country less reliant on fossil fuels. And to really move the needle on renewable sources. We see measures being taken in that regard, and I think that like I said, is encouraging. But I think what's key is to ensure consistency in policy, and that was the point I was really trying to make sure that even as things change and evolve, that some of these commitments are adhered to, so that then investors could confidently put their money behind some of these potentially longer term payback, or investments which have a longer term payback, and feel confident about their returns as they do so. So yeah, I think that would be perhaps an example from an industry standpoint. Again, there's investments and know-how that's going into less energy intensive methods of manufacturing, and that working closely with industrial partners, engineering talent from both in Sri Lanka and outside, to look at our machinery, look at our processes, from sewing to heating to dyeing, all these different processes to make it less energy intensive. And as technology advances, I think those will continue to improve. But it needs to be a combination of those two: consistency in terms of energy policy, skewed towards sustainable energy sources, and then investments in less energy intensive methods and machinery. I think that's combination of that is what will make us sustainable on that front, on that example over the long run.
It's time to take a short break. When we return, we'll resume our conversation on the apparel industry.
Display your brand message on digital screens at prime locations. The largest digital advertising network in Sri Lanka. Emerging Media.
You're mobile, and so are we.
Gets me going.
Grab the Lite 87 app at the Apple App Store or Google Play now.
87.8 and 87.6 island-wide. Lite 87.
Welcome back. We're talking to the Chief Marketing Officer of MAS Intimates, Jehan Jayasuriya. Jehan, we always say that innovation is a key driver of growth for any industry, especially yours. How would you rate the innovation potential of Sri Lanka as of now?
So I think as we think of innovation, there are multiple layers of innovation that I think the industry can think about. The most obvious one is on product. And that's an area where I think the industry has, Sri Lanka has done well. In terms of conceptualizing, creating meaningful product for consumers the world over, and doing so in collaboration with brands who then take those products out to those consumers. So I think that's important, and that continues to be important for us, because I think even as much as retail markets slow down, consumer spending slows down, if at all, relevant, meaningful, impactful product becomes even more important, right, for our brand partners. So I think whatever we can do on this end to help them create those products, I think is going to be key. So product innovation clearly is one side of it. I spoke earlier about speed, agility, and business models. Whether you call it business model innovation or process innovation, we've spoken about in the past about our industry having adopted lean manufacturing principles inspired by the automobile industry of Japan and other parts of the world. Sri Lanka is renowned for that in terms of just eliminating waste, having lean, faster processes than perhaps its peer countries. I think that can now act as a platform to innovate on process and innovate on business models. Now that and really looking at our industry or our companies as an extension of the fashion value chain. I think that's where the big unlock is. You could practice lean principles within your organization, and then you take out waste within a certain frame. As you start to build that, on one side, you could build that towards your supply chain. So on the backward integration side, you could also think about it towards the brand side, and at that point, you get more and more into the fashion industry and the dynamics that are involved there. And I think if you're able to, and then you have an overlay of logistics in there as well. The process innovation or the process excellence capabilities that we've built, I think we're able to take it across all these different elements and start to see it now as a more holistic scope, and engage with our brands in a way that perhaps we haven't done as much before to really unlock value. So that might be another form of, or another way of lens in which we can view innovation. And perhaps closely tied to that might be the work that we do on digital excellence, which again I spoke of earlier. We are able to do things very differently through the enhanced digital capabilities the industry is now able to access. And I mean that both from in terms of supply chain synergy, shop floor synergy, so digital transformation on the shop floor, for example, so that we are able to gain sort of, there are data-driven decisions or insights on which we can make decisions on the shop floor, on supply chains, even up until product creation. So even product innovation could be done based on these data-driven insights in ways in which we haven't been able to do before. Because sitting here in Sri Lanka, our product creation or technical teams or folks who appreciate materials and product may not have had the same kind of access into the Western markets as they may have today. You're able to access the same web front and engage with brands, social media, and now even the metaverse in ways that a Western consumer would. And that's incredible insight for our industry and people who work here to bring in as inputs to then feed into their product innovation work, as well as some of the process or business model innovation work that we do. So again, innovation continues to be clearly an important differentiator for the industry. But the lens in which we look at it, I think, has to continue evolving, and I think that's what we're looking for.
Looking a bit into the future, Jehan, what are the trends that you can see for the apparel industry for the rest of 2023?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Just a little while ago, I said it's a tough market to read for the different factors that are influencing it being a little unpredictable. But if you take a step back and try to draw some common threads or sort of identify some common threads that we see, I think firstly, we see some level of easing out of inflation in the Western markets, certainly in the United States, and then maybe followed a little bit by Europe in terms of consumer spending or consumer confidence slowly starting to return. I think it's perhaps premature to say that things are on a path to recovery, but I think perhaps a better way to frame it might be to say that erosion that we saw over the last quarter and leading into this quarter will potentially bottom out over the next, again, it's tough to give a timeline to it, but over the next 3 to 6 months, right? So you could see that some of that pessimism starting to move away. You can see that in the stock market prices in the Nasdaq and in Western share exchanges, and start to see some bottoming out effect taking place. What we're seeing on top of that, because of all the uncertainty that we are all exposed to in global political macroeconomic environment, we see customers, despite things stabilizing, customers taking a conservative view, especially towards inventory. I think there was a significant beating that most brands took by holding excess inventory. And that's a position that most don't want to go, any of our customers don't want to go back to again. So despite sales being relatively stable, despite inventory levels getting to perhaps a more acceptable level, we see a drive towards most brands making their supply chains leaner. So hence a recovery that potentially could have taken place maybe in quarter 2 or 3 this year might even get pushed back a little bit as brands start to focus a little bit more on making or building or investing in leaner, more agile and nimble supply chains. I think that's one thing to watch out for, but I think a recovery will take place. Will the recovery be sharp? In 2020, there was this big dip and a sharp recovery that was driven by an enforced shutdown or due to COVID. The world just shut down, and when markets opened up, it quickly corrected back. I think this is going to look different. This is not necessarily an enforced shutdown. There's a component of that correction, or rather the recovery being too sharp and the correction then taking place. There's also the undeniable fact that there was a lot of stimulus dollars and euros and otherwise being pumped into the Western markets, which drew a lot of consumer spending. And there needs to be some cool-off period where that gets sort of pulled out of those economies. So my read on this is that perhaps the recovery will be a long drawn-out one. Again, it's difficult to put dates and months to what this might be, but it perhaps won't be a quarter or 6 months. This recovery will take place, I would think, for the better part of 2023, maybe even leading up into 2024. So that's pretty much the read. So it's not hopefully not further deterioration towards the rest of the year. Some level of bottoming out by mid-year and a slow recovery towards the end of the year is really where we are thinking at this point in terms of the outlook for the Sri Lankan apparel.
Jehan, let's move on to a slightly different area. LMD recently launched a campaign titled Refresh Sri Lanka, where we are encouraging a mindset change to create a more civic-minded society. When we look at the apparel industry and the journey ahead, what are the main focus areas that will ensure that civic-mindedness and societal well-being are not removed from the agenda?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point. The apparel industry, folks who have been successful over longer periods of time have approached the industry with the mindset that you described, civic-mindedness. It is an industry that is very reliant on large pools of human capital, of labor, right? Again, I mentioned earlier, the apparel industry is one of the largest, if not the largest, private sector employer in our country, and that is true of the industry's role in countries like Bangladesh and others who play in this industry at scale. And when you think about the dynamics, then that entails, it does require. For an industry to be successful, it does require engagement with large numbers of human capital, often in rural environments, in some cases less privileged environments or less urbanized environments. It's an industry that in many ways that has the potential to uplift societies and communities, in some cases out of poverty, in some cases bring them on the path towards continuous development. So the companies or the players who understood this well are those who have gone in and invested in communities. When I say invested in communities, the people and the broader ecosystems, the entrepreneurs involved, as well as the schools, the hospitals, the other institutes that are part of that locality, and really act as a conduit of bringing together all these different institutions to the upliftment of that society. Sri Lanka, over the last 3 decades, has benefited in a number of ways. Again, we had a policy at one point in our government of uplifting societies using these factory ecosystems, and I think it has definitely contributed towards development in those areas. We're seeing, today, as we sort of again look at the global industry, we're seeing similar initiatives being taken place in Africa and other parts of the world as well, again, as different points of maturity in our industry. So I think if you think of sustainable long-term development of the industry, it has to be civic-minded. I think if you start to think of this as almost as exploitative of wherever cheap labor exists, and to do so, it becomes tactical and short-term. It doesn't sustain over the long period of time. And that is why I think our industry here in Sri Lanka, despite not having grown exponentially like some others, has, despite all the different headwinds that we've encountered, remained resilient and either stayed flat or maybe even at a marginal growth rate, despite all the things that we had to encounter. So going forward, we had an interesting crossroads, especially in Sri Lanka, because it's almost a redefinition or another paradigm shift in civic mindedness that the industry is required to bring in with everything that is going on in the country. Because they, unlike perhaps even in the past, export-oriented industries like apparel will have to play a leading role in doing this, as some of the more domestic or import-oriented industries and some of the others struggle potentially more than exporters. So, again, I think if we are to come through and be successful long-term, building societies while building the industry, I don't think it is mutually exclusive. I think it's complementary and needs to be viewed that way. And going by the evidence of the past, hopefully the main players in the industry will continue to use that lens in taking the industry forward.
We're almost at the end of our discussion, Jehan. Any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our audience today?
Yeah, I think my closing thoughts are to say, as a nation and as an industry, we are heading towards sometimes some scale of volatility and uncertainty. There's no clear view of what lies ahead. And that requires us to move forward with a certain mind frame of resilience. And perhaps a good thing for Sri Lanka is we've gone through, or we've navigated such sort of uncertain, challenging circumstances due to various reasons in our young history as a nation. So I'd like to believe that as Sri Lankans, we are a resilient nation, resilient people who have navigated multiple different challenges in the past and come through them strong. What lies ahead of us, again, now speaking more about the industry, is in principle something similar. We are unable to really decipher and say this is what lies ahead of us, but we know that if we approach it with the strengths we have built over a period of time and strengths we know we have to build as we move forward, and we do so with the correct mindset and correct leadership, backed by consistent policy framework, that the vision that we have set out for ourselves is achievable. So I'd like to end on a note of optimism, despite all the concerns and uncertainty ahead of us, to say that because of the spirit of Sri Lankans and the resilience that we've shown, that we will be able to work through what lies ahead and continue to make this industry and our nation stronger as we move forward.
Thank you, Jehan. It's been very nice having you on the show. Thank you for all your insights.
You're most welcome. Thank you. It was a pleasure being on the show.
And to our viewers, until next time, take care.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching and stay safe.